The police have charged the co-founder of Palestine Action under the Terrorism Act. The co-founder of Palestine Action has been charged with violating the Terrorism Act after a series of speeches in Manchester and Bradford. Richard Barnard stands accused of expressing an opinion that is supportive of a prescribed organisation contrary to Section 12 of the Terrorism Act 2000. Bernard, 41, will appear before the Westminster Magistrates Court on the 18th of September, where he also faces 2 charges of encouraging or intending to encourage criminal damage. The charges stem from an investigation by the Specialised Counter-Terrorism Policing Northwest Unit into a demonstration held on the 8th of October in Manchester after Hamas launched an attack on southern Israel. So what kind of criminal damage has activists caused as Palestine Action? The activist was a member of the Filton 10 who dismantled the research hub of Israel's biggest weapon firm, Elbit Systems. The action caused over £1 million in damage to the heavily guarded Filton-based research hub of Israel's biggest weapons producer, which was opened in the summer of 2023. In total, 10 activists have been charged in connection to the Filton action, all of whom were first detained without charge for nearly a week and interrogated constantly under the powers granted by the Terrorism Act. So activists in the group haven't taken to the streets to riot and damage people's homes or businesses. They haven't set hotels on fire. They've specifically targeted weapon systems that is used for the ongoing genocide in Gaza. But the police haven't just targeted Richard. They've gone after journalists too. Richard Medhurst was being one, and Sarah Wilkinson, who was also a Palestine supporter. On the same day, counter-terror cops also arrested prominent journalist and Palestine Action supporter Sarah Wilkinson for online posts. This authoritarian overreach of state power to silence a journalist could breach international law. Specifically, it could contravene Resolution 2022 of the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council said this: the Council condemns unequivocally all attacks and violence against journalists and media workers, such as torture, extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrest, and arbitrary detention, as well as intimidation and harassment in both conflict and non-conflict situations. Well, that certainly sounds like it applies here, and indeed is an overreach on authoritarian power. Cog, let's start off with Bernard. So he's the co-founder of Palestine Action. He's been charged under the Terrorism Act because apparently he's shown support for Hamas. I want to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think that we've got to be extremely careful when we're using anti-terrorist powers, particularly in the case like post 9/11. I think post 9/11, we've got to be really, really careful about how much we let the state creep in to abusing the powers that were given to it supposedly to keep us safe. And I do think it's concerning, but in fairness, I haven't seen like the full extent of the reasons that they have decided to charge him. I'll be interested to read any court documents that are released. And I think we just have to be careful about any double standards being applied here. Stuff to do with the Middle East, stuff to do with people from the Middle East invariably associated with terrorism. Stuff to do with white people always gets the benefit of the doubt. I think that, and you know, I don't know whether Richard Barnard himself is white or not, but it's kind of irrelevant because the big question here is what's he associated with? He's associated with Palestine, and too often Palestine and terrorism are lumped in together, despite the very obvious examples of far right Israeli terrorism. I mean, the literal assassination of oh god, his name's gone from my head. Yitzhak Rabin, the former Israeli PM, literally killed by far right radicals in Israel. But yeah, it's Palestine that's associated with terrorism. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I don't know a whole lot about this particular topic. It's not something that I'm well versed on.
I mean, this is the problem, though, when we run into governments who declare certain organizations as terrorists. Now, of course, you can understand when it's groups that directly want to harm a country, and being seen as supportive of that, you can make the case that some are a threat to our security. But then look and see how Nelson Mandela was considered a terrorist by Thatcher, and those who stood against apartheid in South Africa, they were arrested and accused of being terrorist sympathizers. Now, of course, Mandela was certainly no terrorist, and I'm not here trying to make the case that Hamas aren't. But what I am saying is, being against the genocide of the Palestinians, the state will lump you in as a Hamas supporter. And what that is doing is criminalizing those who are standing up against a grave crime. I mean, do you agree with that?
Yeah. Do I agree with them with them doing that, or do I agree with your assessment? Sorry.
My assessment, yeah. I mean,
Yes, I agree with your assessment.
How the
Sorry,
state
yes.
is lumping anyone as a sort of a Hamas supporter or a terrorist when they're not.
Yeah, I think that is that is broadly I think correct. Again, not something that I'm well versed in this particular area. But I think that we've got to be careful about the just criminalizing dissent as opposed to actually keeping national security at the top of the agenda. And if we're keeping national security at the top of the agenda, it does always have to be borne in mind that most terrorism is homegrown, and that there is a growing threat from the far right that is almost never spoken about in these conversations.
You're absolutely right. And the thing is, though, look, if the government were really concerned about security, if that's all what it is, then why are journalists targeted too? I mean, Richard Medhurst was stopped at an airport. He was detained and arrested under the Terrorism Act. Sarah Wilkinson was arrested for posting online. Now, of course, they don't pose a threat. They're journalists. So obviously we know this is a smokescreen and it's about silencing dissent. I also think that what I find striking is that when the race riots happened, you had fascists set hotels on fire with children inside, physically attacking random people on the street, and they were charged with violent disorders. Yet Palestine Action targeted big companies making money off killing innocents. These activists didn't harm anyone, right? So I want to ask, why were these riots charged, not charged under the Terrorism Act, even though they literally spread terror based on their political beliefs? But journalists and activists are being seen as terrorists by the state. They have little power already, and they're trying to do their best to stop, our complicity in the actions of Israel. You mentioned that no one really talks about the far right. Why is there sort of a double standard here?
Yeah, I mean, you said they were fascists. I think you'll find they were pro-British protesters. Was the phrase that was used about them, right?
Yeah,
pro-British protesters. The kind of disconnect there is huge. But when it comes to terror, so the way I was taught it when I in my political science lessons from uni, because I did history and politics at uni, and we had to do a degree of international relations, and the way that we were taught was like the universal definition of terrorism is using violence or the fear of violence upon citizens, upon civilians, in order to try to enact some political change, to try to enact political change. But by this definition, given the what happened on October 7th, relatively small fry compared to what the terrorist state of Israel has actually done since, but it falls under the Terrorism Act. It does. It falls under not the Terrorism Act, the definition of terrorism. Now, UK law works slightly differently. What falls under the Terrorism Act is determined by what is a terrorist organization and, a classified terrorist organization. However, I think it's pretty undeniable that by the same standards that you would apply there, by the standard of, X group is trying to influence the government policy by using fear, intimidation, and violence against the civilian population, the riots fit that definition. They are right-wing terrorists, and they should have been called right-wing terrorists. But the way that UK law works doesn't actually line up with the reality of how we talk about and understand terrorism.
Patreon.com/turnleftmedia. Support independent media. Support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn Left.